Chapter 15. During this period, we maintained a connection with the Three Self Church, telling no one that our father was a pastor of the Underground Church. The Three Self Church is the official church which has state permission to use and even build new churches. As I have said, it called itself the Three Self Church because it had three principles: self-determination, self-support, and self-propagation. It had been founded when all the foreign missionaries were forced to leave the country in 1949-50. At that point, the Christians in China were suddenly thrown back on their own resources. In order to prove that Christianity wasn't just a Western movement, the country's Christians set up their own Chinese church. The state couldn't do much about this, though it tried again and again to exercise influence over it, with varying degrees of success. The patriotic Chinese Catholic Church functioned in much the same manner. Independent from the overseas church, thus also from the Pope in Rome, they fashioned their own masses and consecrated their own priests. The Catholics, too, had an underground church, which hadn't renounced Rome and continued to belong to the worldwide Catholic communion. This didn't suit the state at all, as it would tolerate no foreign interference, which is how it regarded the spiritual responsibility of the Pope for all Catholics. The evangelical Three Self Church described itself as a post-denominational church. The various denominations, Lutheran, Methodist, Baptist, Anglican, no longer existed. In the Three Self Church, all evangelical Christians were united. It was still obvious from their services what sort of denomination they had come from, but ostensibly there was just one evangelical church. The state made no moves to stop it because its informants and the fact that the services were held in public showed that no subversive and revolutionary plans were being hatched there. In the first few years after 1950, the state controlled this church strictly and even exercised a strong influence over its leading bishops. At the same time, there was growing conflict with the house churches. There was mutual suspicion and betrayal. Christians on both sides ended up in prison because of false witness, and there was a lot of guilt. Luckily, this time is long past, if not yet quite resolved. The state couldn't maintain such strict control over the underground churches, and that's why it was so suspicious of them. It declared their meetings illegal and took upon itself the right to close churches at any time and to arrest collaborators and throw them into jail. Yet the house churches flourished under this pressure and persecution, and the believers were strengthened rather than frightened off. But we were now in the sights of the state police, and our family had a tough time of it in those years. Through a series of miracles, my father managed to flee to Germany in 1997, where we, my mother, Yiling, and I, were submerged in anonymity in the eastern part of China. While here, we would go to the Three Self Church service every Sunday. My faith grew gradually firmer again. I really looked forward to every service in the overfilled church. It did me good to be among cheerful Christians who had no fear of police raids, some of whom stood in the street outside the church and sang loudly without restraint. At the baptism services, I was always amazed by the number of people joining the community. Sometimes there were well over 100 at a time, mostly adults. Once, during a Bible hour at the Three Self Church, at which at least 500 people were present, the pastor asked the congregation what it was that we had been saved by. I went to answer straight away, by faith in Jesus Christ. Yet my mother held me back because this answer might have revealed that we were members of the Underground Church. It wasn't actually dangerous to live as a Christian, and even at school they knew that I went to the Three Self Church. But if they had discovered that we had come from the house church movement, they would have become suspicious. House church is still an emotive term to this day, and many still suspect that sectarian movements lie behind it. But within the Three Self Church, more and more openness and trust were being shown towards the Christians from the underground churches. The enmity of earlier years was a thing of the past. The respective leaders even met in secret to try to build a new relationship with one another. Yet the official party line was that the house communities were still classified as anti-state and counter-revolutionary. So we tried not to be provocative and did not openly declare our allegiance to them. Our contact with the house churches kept growing slowly. However, Christians from house churches would come to visit us in secret or pick us up by car. House church meetings took place mostly in the villages in those days, though today the movement has spread just as widely in the towns. I was even asked again to preach in the house churches. This strengthened my faith, and it often seemed to me that I was preaching to myself. When people started coming to me to have me pray for them and bless them, I knew that God had forgiven me for my disobedience and my resentment of Him. On one short secret visit to my grandmother, I realized that we were seeing each other for the last time. She had no longer left her little apartment now because she had an accident and had broken her leg. Nene had no health insurance and couldn't pay for an extended stay in hospital, so she just lay down for a long time and waited in considerable pain until her bones knit themselves back together. She was looked after by the community in our home village. As she could no longer put weight on her leg, Nene was confined to the house. We would have gladly taken her in, but we were ourselves dependent on the help of other Christians and frequently on the run. Later, my grandmother became so ill that she put on her ornate funeral robe and simply waited for death to fetch her home to Jesus. But when she heard that her son, my father, was safe and able to live in Germany without persecution, she blossomed again and took off her funeral robe and wanted to carry on living and praying that God would bless my father's evangelistic work. She finally died in 2000. None of us were able to be with her.